It was a chilly autumn evening when Sarah decided to walk home from her friend's house instead of taking a cab. The crisp air and falling leaves seemed harmless, and she was eager to save a little money. Besides, the distance wasn't far, just a 20-minute walk through her quiet suburban neighborhood. The streets were dimly lit, with the occasional flicker of a faulty street lamp casting eerie shadows on the pavement. As Sarah walked, the world felt unnervingly still. No cars passed, no dogs barked, and the usual hum of distant traffic was absent. It was as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. She turned onto Oakwood Lane, a street notorious for its old, towering trees that blocked the moonlight. Halfway down the street, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. Stopping abruptly, she turned, expecting to see someone else out for a walk. But there was no one. The street was empty, the shadows motionless. She laughed nervously, convincing herself it was just the echo of her own steps. Continuing on, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The footsteps returned, louder this time, and they didn't match her pace. She stopped again, her heart pounding, and turned around. Still no one was there. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She pulled it out to see an unknown number calling. Hesitant, she answered. "Hello?" she said, her voice trembling. A deep, raspy voice replied, "Why did you stop walking?" Her blood ran cold. She whipped her head around, scanning the street. "Who is this?" The voice chuckled darkly. "Just keep going, Sarah. Don't turn around again." Panic set in. She ended the call and started walking faster, her breaths coming in short gasps. The footsteps grew louder, closer, as if whoever or whatever it was had no intention of hiding anymore. Reaching the end of Oakwood Lane, she turned onto Maple Street, hoping to find someone, anyone. But the houses were dark, their curtains drawn, and the street was deserted. Suddenly, a motion sensor light flickered on in the driveway of a nearby house. Relief flooded her, but it was short-lived. In the glow of the light, she saw a shadowy figure standing in the middle of the street, motionless. It was tall and unnaturally thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. She couldn't make out its face, but she knew it was looking at her. She bolted, running as fast as she could, her sneakers slapping against the pavement. She didn't dare look back. Her chest burned, and her legs felt like lead, but she pushed forward, adrenaline driving her. As she turned onto another street, she collided with a man. He grabbed her shoulders to steady her. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked, concerned. Relieved, she stammered, "Someone's following me. Please help me." The man looked down the street, his face serious. "I don't see anyone, but let me walk you home." Grateful, Sarah nodded. The man introduced himself as Mark and assured her she was safe. They walked together, and for the first time that night, she felt a sliver of hope. But as they approached her house, Sarah noticed something odd. Mark's reflection didn't appear in the windows they passed. Her stomach dropped. Trying to stay calm, she said, "Thank you for walking me home. I think I'll be fine from here." Mark smiled, his teeth unnaturally sharp. "Oh, Sarah, I can't leave you now. We're just getting started." Before she could react, Mark's form twisted and distorted. His skin darkened, his limbs elongating into grotesque shapes. His eyes turned black as coal, and his grin stretched impossibly wide. Sarah screamed and ran into her house, slamming the door behind her. She locked it and grabbed a knife from the kitchen. her hands shaking violently. The house was silent, but she felt his presence. The air grew colder, and the lights flickered. She heard the sound of footsteps upstairs, slow, deliberate. Terrified, she crept towards the stairs, clutching the knife. Reaching the top, she saw her bedroom door ajar, a faint light spilling out. "Sarah," a voice called from inside, eerily calm. Summoning every ounce of courage, she pushed the door open. The room was empty except for a mirror on the wall, but the reflection wasn't hers. In the mirror, Mark stood grinning, his black eyes staring at her. Suddenly, his arm shot out of the mirror, grabbing her wrist. She screamed and slashed at him with the knife, shattering the glass. Everything went silent. When she looked up, the mirror was gone, replaced by a blank wall. She thought it was over, until her phone buzzed again. The same unknown number. This time, the message read, "You can't escape me, Sarah. I'm always watching." The footsteps resumed, louder than ever, coming from all directions. And then the lights went out. It was nearly midnight when Jake decided to take a shortcut home through Old Hollow Trail. The trail cut through a forest on the outskirts of town, and though locals whispered about strange happenings there, Jake dismissed the stories as nonsense. He was young, confident, and in a hurry to get home after a late shift at the diner. The air was crisp, and the trees on either side of the trail loomed tall, their branches interlocking above him to form a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. His phone's flashlight provided a weak beam of light, casting eerie shadows on the dirt path. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves under his boots and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. About 10 minutes into the walk, Jake felt it, the sensation of being watched. He paused, shining his flashlight around. The forest was dense, and the shadows played tricks on his mind. Shrugging it off, he muttered, "Get a grip, Jake," and kept walking. A few minutes later, he heard it, a faint whisper, too soft to make out the words. He stopped again, his heart pounding now. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing. No response. He quickened his pace, his flashlight trembling in his hand. As he walked, the whispers grew louder, shifting to both sides of the trail. They weren't words, but a soft, sinister murmuring, like the forest itself was alive and conspiring against him. Jake stopped abruptly when his flashlight illuminated something ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the trail. The person was dressed in a black hoodie, their face obscured by the shadows. "Hey!" Jake called, trying to sound braver than he felt. "What are you doing out here?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, like a curious animal. Jake's grip on his flashlight tightened. He thought about turning back, but the idea of retracing his steps through the whispering woods was just as terrifying. Summoning his courage, he stepped forward. "Look, I don't want any trouble. Just let me pass." The figure slowly raised an arm and pointed to the woods on Jake's right. Confused, Jake followed the direction of the finger with his flashlight. The beam landed on something that made his stomach drop. A second figure, identical to the first, standing among the trees. He spun around to his left and saw another figure, then another behind him. They were all identical, motionless and eerily silent. Panic set in. Jake bolted, running as fast as he could down the trail. His flashlight bounced wildly, illuminating fleeting glimpses of the trees and the path ahead. The whispers turned into a cacophony of hissing surrounding him. Suddenly, the ground beneath his feet felt wrong, soft, spongy, like he was running on something alive. He stumbled and fell, the flashlight slipping from his hand and rolling a few feet away. Scrambling to grab it, he noticed the ground wasn't dirt anymore. It was black, glistening, and pulsating like a living thing. Terrified, he grabbed the flashlight and got back to his feet. The figures were gone, but the trail ahead had changed. Instead of the familiar dirt path, it was now a narrow corridor of twisted trees that seemed to lean closer with every step he took. He hesitated, but the whispers behind him grew louder, urging him forward. He walked cautiously, his flashlight flickering as if it were struggling against some unseen force. Then he heard it, a soft, childlike giggle. "Who's there?" he shouted, spinning around. A little girl stepped out from behind a tree, her pale face illuminated by the flashlight. She wore a white dress, dirty and torn, and her eyes were wide and unblinking. "Are you lost?" she asked in a sweet but unsettling voice. Jake's throat went dry. "What are you doing out here, kid? Where are your parents?" The girl smiled, revealing teeth that were far too sharp. "They're here," she whispered, pointing behind him. Jake turned slowly, and his heart nearly stopped. The figures were back, but this time their faces were visible, pale, hollow, and featureless with deep black voids where their eyes should have been. He turned to run again, but the girl grabbed his wrist. Her small hand was ice cold, and her grip was unnaturally strong. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice now distorted and inhuman. Jake screamed and yanked his arm free, bolting blindly into the forest. He didn't care about the trail anymore. He just wanted to get away. Branches scratched at his face and arms as he ran, the whispers and laughter following close behind. After what felt like hours, he burst out of the woods and onto a quiet street. He collapsed to his knees, gasping for air, and looked back. The forest was silent and still, as if nothing had happened. He stumbled home, his mind racing. When he reached his apartment, he locked the door and collapsed onto his bed, trying to convince himself it was all a hallucination. But as he drifted off to sleep, he heard it again, the faint whispering coming from inside his room. His eyes snapped open, and he saw them, the figures standing in the corners of his room, their hollow faces staring at him. The last thing Jake heard was the little girl's giggle, and then the lights went out. It was a clear, cold night when Mia decided to take the long way home after her evening class. Her usual route was under construction, and the detour signs directed her down Old Pine Road, a stretch of asphalt that cut through an isolated area surrounded by dense woods. Mia had heard stories about the road, tales of people getting lost, seeing strange things, and never making it to the other side, but she brushed them off as urban legends. With her headphones in and her backpack slung over one shoulder, Mia walked briskly down the road, her breath visible in the frosty air. The streetlights were spaced far apart, casting long shadows that seemed to move as she passed. About 10 minutes into her walk, Mia noticed how quiet it was. Too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the soft sound of her footsteps on the pavement. She pulled out one earbud, hoping to hear something natural, but the silence pressed down on her like a weight. She glanced at her phone and frowned. The GPS wasn't loading, and the battery, which had been at 60% when she left class, was now inexplicably at 5%. She groaned, stuffing it back into her pocket. "Great," she muttered. As she continued, she felt an odd sense of déjà vu. The road ahead looked exactly the same as the one she'd been walking on moments ago. The same bent streetlight, the same cracked pavement, the same darkened mailbox leaning to one side. She stopped and turned around, expecting to see the way she'd come. But there was nothing. The road behind her was gone, replaced by an unbroken expanse of trees. Her heart began to race. "No," she whispered, spinning back around. The road ahead stretched endlessly, disappearing into the darkness. She started walking faster, her footsteps echoing louder than they should have. Every few minutes, she glanced over her shoulder, feeling the undeniable sensation of being followed. But each time she looked, there was nothing. The first twist came when she saw someone ahead, an old man standing in the middle of the road. He was hunched over, wearing a tattered coat and holding a lantern that flickered weakly. Relief flooded Mia's chest. "Excuse me," she called, jogging toward him. "Can you help me? I think I'm lost." The man turned slowly, his face pale and gaunt. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and filled with something Mia couldn't quite place, fear. Or was it something worse? "You shouldn't be here," he croaked, his voice raspy and strained. "Turn back." Mia frowned. "I can't. The road behind me." The man's lantern flickered out, plunging them into darkness. When the light returned a second later, he was gone. Panic set in. She began running, her breaths coming in sharp gasps. The road didn't change. It remained the same monotonous stretch, with no landmarks, no signs, and no end. That's when she started hearing it, the soft sound of footsteps behind her. They were faint at first, almost imperceptible, but they grew louder with each passing second. Mia forced herself not to look back. She kept running until her legs burned, but the footsteps stayed close, matching her pace. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She stopped and spun around, shouting, "Who's there?" The road was empty. But then she noticed something strange. Her own shadow, cast by the dim streetlights, didn't move as she did. It stood still, slightly hunched, and then it began to shift. The shadow detached from her, rising from the ground and taking on a form, a dark, featureless figure with long, spindly limbs and glowing red eyes. Mia screamed and turned to run, but the road ahead was no longer empty. Dozens of figures stood there, each identical to the one behind her, their eyes glowing like embers. "No," she whispered, backing away. The figures didn't move, but the air around them seemed to pulse, growing colder and heavier. Mia turned and ran into the woods, leaving the road behind. The branches scratched at her arms and face, but she didn't stop. She burst into a clearing and froze. In the center of the clearing stood a small, decrepit cabin. The windows were dark, and the door hung open on rusted hinges. She had no choice. The footsteps and whispers were closing in behind her. She bolted for the cabin, slamming the door shut behind her. The interior was cold and smelled of rot. A single candle flickered on a wooden table in the center of the room, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Mia's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, surprised to see it had 1% battery left. A notification popped up. "Unknown number? Don't look out the window." Her stomach dropped. Slowly she turned toward the nearest window. At first, she saw nothing but darkness. Then a pale face appeared, pressed against the glass, its mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. She stumbled back, knocking the table over and extinguishing the candle. The cabin plunged into darkness. The door creaked open, though she hadn't touched it. A voice whispered, "You can't leave, Mia." The last thing she saw before her phone died was the red glow of dozens of eyes surrounding her.